And can you allow me to share my screen? Thank you. All right, can you all see it? It says Women's History Panel. Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Marissa Salazar. I'm a psychology instructor here at Cuyamaca College. I see a few familiar faces, so good to see you all today. And then Moriah, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thanks, Marissa. Sorry, folks, trying to manage the waiting room and all of the other fun logistics behind the scene. So I apologize for the delay there in getting myself unmuted. My name is Moriah Gonzalez-Meeks. I teach history here at Cuyamaca College. I have a background in women's studies as well as history. So this is sort of where all of my interests align. So thank you so much for joining us today.
706.
Thank you. And before we get started, just a few norms for today. When you're not talking, if you could please mute yourself, that would be great. So that way it doesn't pick up on any background noise. As I'm talking, my husband is in an appointment and I can hear him through the wall of my office. So if that picks up, I'm apologizing in advance. If you could use the raise hand button, if you have a question or comment, that would also be great because there's so many of us on here. And so sometimes it gets kind of hard to manage when we're all unmuting ourselves at once. As always, feel free to use the chat as well. And just a reminder that this is a hate-free zone. We know that everybody has different lived experiences and comes to class with different lived experiences, but we ask that you respect each other and respect diversity, and any hateful comments, remarks, behaviors will not be tolerated. So let's get started. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what famous women in history do you know? So I think, Moriah, if you could drop that link in the chat, it's going to take you to a word cloud activity. And in the word cloud, just type in 3 famous women that come to mind. If you can't think of 3 famous women, that's totally fine. If you just can think of one name that comes to the top of your head, that's fine as well. So let's just take a minute to do that together. And again, the link should be in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to pull up the word cloud so we can all see what everybody is typing.
Marissa, do you want to screen share the, the word cloud so everyone can see?
Yes, sorry.
No worries, it's all good.
Okay, let me share. Oh, so we have a lot of different names here. Rosa Parks is one that comes to mind. Harriet Tubman, Amelia Earhart, Marie Curie, Michelle Obama, RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Ida B. Wells. I'm trying to see. All right, so it seems like the main themes, if you can see the bigger the words, that means that the more people put these words, right? So Rosa Parks, Amelia Earhart, Harriet Tubman, Michelle Obama, Marie Curie, Aretha Franklin, Maya Angelou. And it's not surprising, right, that these are some of the women that come to our mind, because these are the women that are covered when we're, learning about famous people in history in K through 12 and even in some college classes. So it's really important to understand where we came from and some of the great influential women throughout history. But we also know that historically, women's achievements haven't been covered as much as males' achievements, right? We know that globally, women make up almost half of the world's population, but they're still underrepresented in many different fields. We also know that historically, men's achievements have been recognized more often than women. This isn't an opinion, it's a fact. And that there is still a gender wage gap. So when we're looking at issues like gender equality, right, and gender equity, we can look at the wage gap to really see what's happening. So a couple of quick statistics. We know that for every dollar a male earns of all races, women earn about 80 cents per dollar. Now, when we break it down by race or ethnicity, we know that Asian women earn about 90 cents per dollar. We know that white women earn about 79 cents per dollar. Black or African-American women earn 62 cents per dollar. American Indian and Alaska Native women earn 54 cents per dollar. And Latina or Latinx women earn about 50 cents on the dollar compared to males. So women's history, incredibly important. My research is in public health, and I look at social and structural disparities among men and women. So that's kind of how I frame it and the importance of studying women's history. Moriah, do you want to say a little bit more about why you feel women's history is important?
Yes, thanks, Marissa. So as a historian, right, I think that knowing about the past and understanding what's happened in the past, that's the only way we're going to understand and have context for the things that are going on now that are affecting us in our daily lives. So that's sort of an in general reason why I think history is important. But as Marissa said, it's particularly important when we're talking about women's history, and particularly when we're talking about marginalized groups of women whose histories are often not included in the dominant historical narrative, right? We often don't hear about famous women, and particularly famous women of color, right? We have some examples that you all brought, which were really fantastic. But, how we've learned about these women, where we've heard about them, did we learn about it when we got to college? Did we learn about it in elementary school? What do we know about these women, right? So all of these stories are incredibly important. And I think that that's the particular importance of women's history, is trying to bring to light some of these stories that haven't been included in the dominant historical. So I think that that for me is why women's history is so crucial, and why Women's History Month is so crucial, because you get to talk about the things that are happening now, right? And you get to talk about the roots of them, right? And how they're built into systems within the United States and, across the globe.
And important to note, just like every month that we celebrate, while we're specifically talking about women's history this month, it's important to continue these conversations outside of Women's History Month, right? All right, thank you, Moriah.
You're welcome. Every month is Women's History Month for me, so.
There we go. So the way the format is going to work is I'm going to cover two women that have had some great accomplishments, and then Moriah is going to cover two women, and then we're going to, if we have time, do some breakout room activities, and we'll show you a couple of short film clips for each of our separate presentations. So the first person that I want to cover is Henrietta Lacks. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Henrietta Lacks, if you've learned about her maybe in your science courses, perhaps your biology courses, for example. But I'm going to tell you why she is one of the most important women in medical history, and why a lot of people do not know about her. So Henrietta was born in Roanoke, Virginia in 1920. In 1941, she married and moved to Maryland. And with her husband, David, they had 5 children, Lawrence, Elsie, David Jr., Deborah, and Joseph. She was originally born, she was named Loretta, but later she changed her name herself to Henrietta. And she was a tobacco farmer. So she worked on the tobacco farms in Maryland. And some background information about her, just about her hobbies and likes. She really liked to cook, and her family said she really liked to dance. And one like fun fact about her from her book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, is that she was always wearing red nail polish. That was something that she really liked to wear. So she had 5 children, and she was living this life on the tobacco farm with her family. Her home was always a place, people said, where everyone was welcome. Kind of the door was always open for anyone to come in and talk to Henrietta, spend time with her family. Well, in 1951, she started having these stomach pains. And so eventually she made an appointment to go see a doctor, and where she went was Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is a very famous hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, right? So when she went, the doctor quickly diagnosed her with cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is a type of cancer where when you finally start feeling the symptoms, so one of the symptoms she described was kind of like a knot in her stomach. It's usually very advanced, and it's very hard to treat and get a good prognosis at that point. So by the time she went to the doctor, her cervical cancer was very advanced. And so you can see she went to the doctor in January of 1951, and she passed away in October of 1951. Well, while she was at the doctor, what happened was there were 2 cervical samples that were removed during radiation treatment. So she had a tumor, and the physicians went in and they removed samples of her cells without her knowledge. And this is really problematic now, right? This is something that could never happen today because of our laws around human subjects protections, protecting patients and patients' rights and knowledge. But because of this specific case, that is why we have a lot of the protections in place that we do today. So these cervical samples were taken. It seems kind of routine, something that a doctor might do to be able to test the cells, see what's really going on during radiation. Again, they were taken without her consent, but something really, really cool happened to Henrietta's cells. So her cells actually were taken into a lab and they were cultured in a petri dish. What happened was these cells multiplied, and they kept multiplying in the lab multiple times. And so what happened was this was the first immortal human cell line, or the HeLa cells, H-E-L-A. So the physician that was culturing Henrietta's cells labeled the petri dish HeLa because that was very common in that time to label the cells based on the patient's first and last name, their initials. So they called it these HeLa cells, and it's an immortal human cell line because the cells kept multiplying, and the cells are able to be used in scientific research, in medical research, even today. Now, when people try to explain why Henrietta's cells did this and others do not, the answer is kind of still like, we don't fully know. We don't fully know why Henrietta's cells were so special and they were able to multiply when they were isolated in the lab. Some of the things that the HeLa cells have been used for is to study several different diseases, including polio. So the polio vaccine was actually developed using the HeLa cell line. And polio, if you're unaware, is almost completely eradicated in every single continent except for Asia, where it's endemic to Pakistan and Afghanistan, meaning it's kind of just always there in those regions. It's also, her cells are used in vitro fertilization. So if a couple cannot conceive a child, they might turn to in vitro fertilization, and Henrietta's cells were used there. There's been over 10,000 patents that were registered using HeLa cells, which means that companies profited off of the HeLa cell line. This is really important and really controversial because Henrietta Lacks' family didn't actually know about the cell line until the 1970s, even though all of this started in the 1950s. And so companies and research institutions were using these cells, they were sharing these cells amongst each other, right? But nobody knew whose cells they were, and she wasn't being paid kind of the homage that she deserves, right? Because without these cells, we wouldn't be able to do things like eradicate polio. We wouldn't be able to study the COVID-19 vaccines development, which her cells are still used for that. So the Lacks family learned about that in the 1970s. And there's some controversy over whether or not her cells should still be used today. And especially in the context of Black Lives Matter, social justice movements. And the family actually says that they want her cell line to keep being used because while what happened was horrible, the fact that Henrietta did not know that her cells were being used, that her cell samples were taken from her without her knowledge, they see that from kind of this darkness, right, comes something positive, comes all of these advances that have been made within the scientific field of medicine and biology, et cetera. So I want to show you a short clip about her legacy, which is put on by Johns Hopkins. Remember, that's the hospital where she went, as well as her family, who runs a foundation. And so then we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let me escape this. And do you all see YouTube? Actually, let me stop share and reshare to do the optimize video sound. Whatever that is. All right, 1, 2.
At the center of the Henrietta Lacks story are people asking questions. For people trying to understand the biology of human cells, it's there for bioethicists, for patients. This is why Johns Hopkins is committed to outreach and education for all the community.
It's a labor of love. We all feel like we're connected to this beautiful woman who we call the mother of medicine. It really makes you think about how powerful an impact one person unknowingly could make.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming to learn more about my great-grandmother and what her legacy has left for all of us here today. So over 60 years ago,
in my capacity as the Director of Outreach for the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, I organize educational programs related to Henrietta Lacks. And the main focus is to increase awareness of Henrietta Lacks' impact on medicine and society, to gain a better understanding of the science behind HeLa cells, and also to create an open dialogue about the social issues that were occurring around the time in which Henrietta Lacks' cells were cultured.
I would say that Henrietta is probably, if not the most important, certainly one of the most important women in science and medicine. And we all learn and follow Henrietta Lacks' legacy as we contribute to research and medicine.
Henrietta Lacks was a 31-year-old woman admitted to Johns Hopkins in.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you a short clip of how Hopkins is trying to, kind of in a way, right their wrongs. But Henrietta's family was never directly compensated by Johns Hopkins. Some private laboratories are compensating the Henrietta Lacks Foundation. So for example, UCSD and a UK-based biomed company, both of those organizations have been compensating the Henrietta Lacks Foundation, which was founded in 2010 after this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, came out. It's by Rebecca Skloot. It's a really great book where the author interviews family members and really gets a lot of the background information about Henrietta, as well as how the family members feel about what happened. And then I had a quote from one of her grandsons that I cannot find right now. Let's see. So something that came out of this was that scientists realized that there need to be more protections in place for patients as well as for participants in research studies. And so the process of informed consent came out of this, as well as the Tuskegee syphilis study. And telling patients and telling participants how their data is going to be used. So that way, if you go into a medical procedure, for example, you'll get a consent form, 6, 7, 8 pages filled with jargon, but in there, it tells you exactly how your information and how if it's cell tissue, for example, is going to be used as a result of what happened with Henrietta Lacks. And so, like I said, they learned about her cells in the 1970s. And while there is controversy, overall, family members want her cell line to keep going and to keep being studied because of all of the positive things that have come out of it. So before we move on to the next woman in history, is there any questions or comments about Henrietta? And again, if you all are interested, please be sure to check out that book. It's a really great book. Is it Bennett? Are you raising your hand?
Just like in the chat here, was her or her family ever compensated from either the book or all the vaccines that were made from her cells?
Right. So certain institutions have compensated the family and have donated to that Henrietta Lacks Foundation. But Hopkins itself, to my knowledge, has never actually paid the family for using the cells. So it's kind of like on a case-by-case basis. Different organizations and institutions who decide to do it will compensate, whereas others do not. And so that's kind of where a lot of the controversy comes from, right? If we're using these human cells and the cell line is connected to living family members too, should they be compensated is kind of the argument around it. Anyone else? All right. So the theme of my presentations are all about scientific discoveries. So my PhD is in public health and my master's is in psychology, and I like to kind of use the two in my work with research. So I wanted to cover Henrietta because, again, she's one of the most important women in medical history, but I also want to cover a more current woman. And so the next person that I'm covering is Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, or Kizzy, as she goes by. And I want to tell you a little bit about her and why she is so important and why it's really important to study her right now. So Dr. Kizzy Corbett, oh, were you going to say something?
Yeah, sorry. Part of the screen is obscured. I don't know, so we can't see all of the slide. Maybe if you
I have to like reshare, right? That weird thing.
So yeah, there was part of the slide was covered, and we've seen the one before, so it wasn't as big a deal, but I want to make sure everyone can see this one.
Okay, let's see. You would think that Zoom would come out with a function where like you don't have to stop and reshare again for this. Okay, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So Dr. Corbett was born in Hurdle Mills, North Carolina in 1986, and her training is as a viral immunologist. So she has a PhD in microbiology and immunology, which is really the study of diseases and different disease strains. And she has a bachelor's in biology as well as sociology. Currently, Dr. Corbett is a research fellow at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So NIAID is under the umbrella of the National Institutes of Health. If you've seen any of the COVID briefings, for example, you see NIAID on the background. That is where Dr. Corbett works. And she's been working as a research fellow there since 2014. Her research specializes in novel vaccine development, specifically for pandemic preparedness. And she has been working on research on novel coronavirus vaccines, as well as universal influenza vaccines, and a universal flu vaccine is set to roll out for phase 1 clinical trials, I believe, next year. So Dr. Corbett has been working on COVID vaccines specifically for many years. This wasn't something that just started when COVID-19 hit. So coronavirus, if some of you are not familiar, there's not just one strain. COVID-19 is the particular strain we're talking about today because it's the strain that was discovered in 2019. So there are other coronavirus strains. And so Dr. Corbett had been working on a vaccine for coronavirus even before the pandemic hit. So what did she do and why is she so important? Well, Dr. Corbett is actually the head of the team that developed the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. And Moderna is one of the 3 vaccines that are currently approved for use in the United States. So her achievement and working on this vaccine team has really made it possible for us in the United States to be able to roll out the COVID-19 vaccine to the entire population. And Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is where she's from, proclaimed January 12th, 2021, Kizzmekia Corbett Day, which was really cool. And she had like a little interview on the news about why she's honored. And she says, I like this quote. She says, "I would say that my role as a scientist is really about my passion and purpose for the world and for giving back to the world." Her work is fascinating, and she's accomplished so much at such a young age. I mean, she was born in 86, so she's what, 30, 36? 35. I just did math on my hands. Yeah, so she's accomplished so much in such a short time, and she's not even what's called an independent principal investigator. She's a research fellow. So the way that NIH works, the National Institutes of Health, is you have to be a research fellow where you're working under somebody who runs a study before you can run a study all by yourself. And so the fact that she is one of the women who's actually really discovered and isolated the COVID-19 strain is just amazing to me. And it's really important that we celebrate this accomplishment and that people know who she is, right? So I want to show you a video where she's actually talking about the vaccine. And I really love it because a lot of times in research, it can get really jargony. And when people are trying to explain, about COVID-19, about the different strains, about what the vaccine is, it's hard to understand sometimes. So I think she puts it in very simple terms here. And it's just a couple of minutes where she goes over what the vaccine can do and why it's important. And this was from a presentation last week. Can you all see?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually thinking of those green people as roadblocks to the viral spread. There are several ways to acquire population immunity via antibody responses, for example. The first of which is by natural infection. Now, we all understand that natural infection can potentially cause severe illness. People even die from COVID-19. So that is not the safest way to elicit immune responses. Also, we understand that the immune responses following natural infection are not as robust as what we've seen with vaccine responses. So the second way is vaccination. Taking all things into account, vaccines can be delivered in multiple different ways. The ways that you're hearing about with these new vaccines are gene-based delivery via messenger mRNA. And I will explain that later. But all in all, whether it be a traditional way of delivering a vaccine or in a more novel approach like we are using, the point of a vaccine is to elicit antibodies in a person so that a person's body can prevent them from being infected and also getting disease. There are also other ways to get antibody responses, like, for example, the direct administration of antibodies. And this is what you've seen with, for plasma therapy. And we will not be talking about that today, but those kinds of therapies, specifically by just giving antibodies to a person, that can be used before an infection or also after an infection. So it can be used almost like a treatment for the disease. Talking about this rapid development of the SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccine, the one thing that frightens a lot of people is that it just happened so fast, particularly more rapidly than we've ever seen any vaccine happen previously. But I wanted to just lay out why that was possible. So the timeline of development started really last January on the 10th, when the sequences of the new virus that was circulating in China were published online. Very quickly, we were able to go into a phase 1 clinical trial. So this is a clinical trial in about 50 people that just asked the question, is the vaccine safe? We were able to do that in 66 days in record time. And the reason why is because there was so much research that went into understanding how to make a really good vaccine for coronaviruses, even prior to this pandemic. So we studied vaccine development in the context of other coronaviruses that really helped to fuel this rapid development in the case of COVID-19 vaccines. How do we do that? This picture looks like a lot, but really just focusing in on that one particular spike protein in the middle. That is the protein that sits on the surface of the coronavirus. This protein's entire job is to latch on to a cell in your body and allow for the virus to get in. So one might hypothesize that if you can disrupt that interaction between the spike protein and your body cells, then you've created an effective way to prevent infection and disease. So that's why we want to talk.
Okay, so this is a 23-minute video. In the front end, she talks about and covers what COVID is, and then at the end, she starts debunking some of the myths around the COVID-19 vaccine, and I can post it in the chat if you're interested. But I wanted to just show her talking about her work because it's really important to kind of contextualize that. So that is really my two women that I'm covering today. So that's all I have for you right now. Does anyone have any questions before we get into Mariah's presentation? Okay, so let me reshare. And yes, let's put the video in the chat right now. Does it look weird, Mariah?
Yeah, the boxes are still there.
Let me reload it.
Yeah, that looks better.
Oh, it does? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, folks, the joys of Zoom. Bear with us for a second.
Good?
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. Perfect. Great. So Marissa has talked about the important role of Black women in medicine, both in the past and today. And I'd like to talk about the role of Black women in journalism, and particularly in investigative journalism. I'm going to talk about Ida B. Wells and Nicole Hannah Jones. So let me start with Ida B. Wells, and then we'll go on through. So Ida B. Wells was born during the Civil War in Mississippi, when slavery was still legal and running in Mississippi. So that's the context in which Ida B. Wells was born. She will go on to, her parents were really passionate about education, and they were very promoting of her taking as many classes as she could. She was enrolled in college, and was actually kicked out of college because she got into a disagreement with the president of that college. I believe it was called Rust College was the name. So you can tell from the outset that she had a lot of ideas, right? And she had no problem in sharing those ideas with the world and with people in positions of authority. So she will become, after that period happens, she's still really young, unfortunately. Her parents died of yellow fever, and she was responsible for her brothers and sisters, whom she helped to raise. She moved to Tennessee and raised her siblings there, right? So from Mississippi to Tennessee. So when she gets to Tennessee, she begins her career as a journalist. And she's done lots of things. She lived to be almost 70 years old, and she had a very active life. And so she has lots of different areas of work that we could choose to focus on, right? Today, we're just going to talk about her work as a journalist. But I want you to know that she was an activist in regards to women's rights, in regards to civil rights, in regards particularly to women voting. She worked as a teacher, right? She was an educator, and she also was very active in urban reforms in Chicago later in her life when she moves there from Tennessee. So really, she's not just a journalist, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, that she's done all of these wonderful things. And so I just wanted to make sure that we were aware, of the sort of full scope of Ida B. Wells' work and her legacy before we go on to talk a bit more about journalism in particular. So just so you know, while I'm talking, you can look, this is an image of her with her 4 children. This is a little bit later in her life. In 1909 was when this photograph was taken with her and her 4 children. So she worked as a journalist, as I said, in Tennessee, and she, covered a lot of things. But what she really becomes well known for and really famous for is her activism opposing lynching, right? And just, I want everybody to understand, lynching is basically murder by a mob, all right, of people. It's not anything that's legally sanctioned. It's not a state, sponsored or state sanctioned execution of someone who's committed crimes. It's none of those things. It's completely and totally illegal. And it's incredibly racially motivated during this time period, and incredibly common, not just in the southeastern portion of the United States, but throughout the United States, typically directed at people of color, and usually as a method of subjugation and intimidation. All right, so just so we all know what lynching is when I use that word, what I'm getting at. So she starts writing about it. This is something that's happening. It's really common, but nobody's talking about it, right? It's not being written about in the papers. It's not considered to be newsworthy until she and other Black journalists really start publishing and writing about it. That's when this starts to get attention. And it's really important to understand that in movements for civil rights, the role that the press plays in exposing, these kinds of injustices and this kind of violence, it's really crucial. All right, it's incredibly important to the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Television was incredibly important to that movement and to demonstrating and sharing, right, what was happening in other parts of the country. And so I want us to understand that newspaper is doing the same thing during this time period, during the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's really exposing the things that are commonplace and that folks are trying to stop, right? So she describes these lynch mobs as acts of terror, right, as terrorist acts. And we would refer to them as such today, right, as domestic terrorist acts. That's how we would talk about them in current day language. But she's one of the first people to really use this language to call them that, and again, to call people out, right, that these things are happening, and more importantly, why they're happening, right? She talks about the why of it, because how these sorts of attacks were framed, and attacks and murders were framed, was that someone had done something wrong, right? And that this was justice. Lots of air quotes today, sorry, if you can't see my air quotes. That was the rationale for lynch mobs. But she argues that that's not the case, right? That folks didn't do anything wrong, or in particular, certain groups of people were targeted for attack and for murder. People who were prominent within their communities, people who challenged the status quo, right? People who were successful business people within Black communities, people who were competing with white business owners, people who would get into arguments with white folks, white women accusing, right, Black men of things, right, of assaults and whatnot. None of these are substantiated, by the way. I want us to be real clear on that. Again, this is not anything that goes through courts or anything like that. And the mere mention of these things could trigger these kinds of attacks and murders. And some were planned in advance, right? Like they were some sort of entertainment, right? And it's really horrific. And I want us to understand the context of what she's fighting against and what she's arguing. And this is considered to be commonplace, right, in particular areas of the country. And she's arguing that this is not anything about justice, that this is about intimidation, right? And oppression, and that we need to fight back, right? And that folks need to know about this and that this is not okay. So that's really what she was talking about. I have a piece from one of her articles, Lynch Law in America, which we'll get to in just a second. But obviously for the time and the place that she lived, this was very controversial, not just because she was Black and saying these things, but because she was a woman as well. And we need to understand the intersectionality of that experience, right, with sexism and racism and how that's going to shape her experience living during this time period. So she received death threats. She was basically run out of town. They burned down the offices where she was working in Tennessee, and she moved to Chicago as a result of that so she could continue her work without endangering herself or her siblings at that point. So if you want to go to the next slide, Marissa, that'd be great. So we can read a little bit. I'm going to read a little bit of what Ida B. Wells wrote, because I think it's important, again, as a historian, to see the primary sources, but I think it's important for you to hear things in her own words. All right, so this is a piece she wrote called Lynch Law in America. She started really talking about lynching in the late 1890s, mid to late 1890s. And this was something that had been going on and that she was aware of, but it became really personal for her when one of her very good friends was lynched. And after that, she really started to become one of the primary things that she focused on. So this is a very short piece of a much longer article called Lynch Law in America. So she wrote, "Men, women, and children were the victims of murder by individuals and murder by mobs, just as they had been when killed at the demands of the unwritten law to prevent Negro domination. Negroes were killed for disputing over terms of contracts with their employers. If a colored man resented the imposition of a white man and the two came to blows, the colored man had to die, either at the hands of the white man then and there, or later at the hands of a mob that speedily gathered. If he showed a spirit of courageous manhood, he was hanged for his pains. Colored women have been murdered because they refused to tell the mobs where relatives could be found for lynching bees." This is just, again, a real short piece of a much longer article where she really gets into it, but this is something that's really crucial, that she's explaining why it's happening, right? That this is not based on anything, right, that's valid, anything that's legal, that these are the perceived, this is about power, basically, right? That's what she's arguing. This is about power and this has got to stop. So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, concerns? And I just wanted to make a note about the language. This is a primary source that's written in the 1900s. So during this time period, they used words like Negro and colored men and women, but these are not appropriate words for us to use today because they're racist and offensive. So please don't use them. I just want to make sure that we understand this is in the context of a primary source written at the beginning of the 20th century. Thoughts, questions about Ida B. Wells?
I have a question about her writing here. When she makes a reference to a lynching bee, what are lynching bees?
Those were the events that I discussed in the prior slide, where basically they would schedule a lynching to occur, okay, sort of like an entertainment event beforehand, before anything, you know, again, there were no reasons, no valid reasons why these murders were happening. But that's what a lynching bee was. It was a pre-scheduled lynching to occur. And it was, I didn't have any pictures of lynching in my slides because they're pretty horrific and traumatizing, and I don't want to traumatize anyone. You know, if you want to see such things, you can Google lynching bee and see they're documented with photographs, and they're pretty horrific. There's children on people's shoulders, and it's like a carnival kind of a vibe to it. And yeah, so that's what a lynching bee is.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else I can clarify? Any questions or thoughts? And Bennett put in the chat, it's very brave of her to speak out at that time. It is incredibly brave of her to speak out during this time period because she's literally, right, putting her life on the line for her beliefs and for her activism. And so it's really important to understand this is investigative journalism, right? This is calling out and speaking truth to power. And that's what she was doing, right? In all of these different contexts and all of the different work that she did. But lynching was an incredibly important topic, like I said, for her. It affected her personally, but it was affecting Black communities and in other parts of the country, Mexican-American communities throughout the United States. And so she actually went speaking across, Europe on speaking tours about this. And this is part of, again, drawing attention to events that are happening and to civil rights violations that are happening. That's how you get things changed, right? As you embarrass people, right? And you draw attention to these horrible things, and that's how we get things done. That's how things got done in the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movement. And so really important, the work that she was doing during this time period. All right, thanks, Marissa. So I wanted to talk about a present day investigative journalist, Nicole Hannah Jones. She was born in Waterloo, Iowa in 1979. So she's 44 years old. She's worked as an investigative journalist for many years. The areas of emphasis that she's really focused on are housing and education segregation, desegregation and resegregation. And these are very personal to her as well. When she was a child, there was a busing initiative to try and desegregate schools. And she was part of one of those initiatives. And so she talks about her experiences as a child attending almost an entirely white school, right? And that it was considered to be desegregated because she and a couple of other African-American children attended those schools. So, this is something, again, that's very personal for her and something that she chose to write about as an adult. And so she's really interested in looking at basically civil rights issues today, right? And how they play out today, and also thinking about the legacy, right, of these things. So she's a journalist. She has an MA in journalism and in communication. Her BA, though, was in history and African-American studies. So I think these things tie really beautifully together and give her a lot of really wonderful context. And you can sort of see the interests that she'll have later on in developing the 1619 Project, which we're going to talk a little bit about in just a moment. But before we do that, again, her interest in busing as a means of desegregation and arguing that busing a few children of color into a predominantly white school is not desegregation, and that those efforts have failed, right? And that this is largely because there's housing segregation, right? Not mandated housing segregation, but as a result of redlining, as a result of people of color not being able to get mortgages in particular areas, not being able to buy houses in particular areas, that this has led to a de facto housing segregation, and that this means that schools are segregated because schools are populated, right, by the areas in which those students live. So if we have housing segregation, then we're going to have educational segregation as well. So she talks a lot about these things, and not just talking about them, but how they came to be, right? How they're built into systems, right? She's very much wanting to tie this to structural racism, that this isn't an accident, that this didn't just happen magically, right? And really trying to draw out the historical connections between the current realities, right, that we're experiencing and living with to, the historical antecedents. So I think it's really important, it's really cool to see her making those kinds of connections, and to talk about these things, not just in history books, right, but really in a way that is very approachable, right, and in a way that's really compelling, and that a greater percentage of the population would see, right, not just people who are interested in reading history books, right, but this is in the New York Times, right, and in the magazine. So this is really exciting for me as a historian to see this kind of discussion of history and its current consequences, in these mainstream publications, and getting the amount of attention that they're getting is really exciting. So let's see. Very interested in promoting journalists of color. And that's why she co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting in 2016. So they have internships and they sponsor different journalists and mentor and those kinds of things, which is really exciting. So I would encourage you to look more into that. I also wanted to, we're going to be talking again about the 1619 project a little bit more. That was something that she began in 2019 to commemorate the 400-year anniversary of the beginning of slavery in the United States in 1619. As a result of that project, she won the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for commentary, which is fantastic. We're going to look at a little bit of the piece that she won the Pulitzer Prize for. But I also want to make sure that it's really, we're going to watch a clip of her. And I think maybe it would be good to do that now. And then we can read the bit from her excerpt, if that's all right, Marissa. We can talk about the controversy around the 1619 project. But I think it's good to see this interview first, and then we can talk a little bit more about the controversy.
Issue, the New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project. It marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia. The series examines the ways the legacy of slavery continues to shape this country. The Times says the project aims to reframe American history and place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The journalist behind the project is New York Times Magazine domestic correspondent Nicole Hannah-Jones. Nicole, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Can you tell us about the genesis of this project? Where did you come up with the idea?
Sure. So I've been thinking about the year 1619 since I was in high school, and I came across that date in a book called The Mayflower. And I just was struck by how people of African descent had been here that long, and I never knew that date and never heard about it. Right. So as the anniversary was approaching the 400th year, I thought that this was a time to actually assess what has that legacy been, and to bring this year, 1619, to most American households where it was probably going to pass without them knowing about it.
You say 1619 is as important as 1776.
Yes. Our decision to buy that first group of 20 to 30 Africans would influence almost everything that would follow after. I think it is foundational. It is as foundational to who we became as a country as our decision in 1776 to break off from the British.
You say Black Americans are the most American of all and our true founding fathers. Can you walk us through from that first ship to today how we're still seeing the signs?
Yeah, so when you think about the fact that when Thomas Jefferson is writing the Declaration and laying out these words for liberation, you know, all men are created equal and born with inalienable rights. And while he's writing that, he owns 130 human beings who are in absolute bondage. And in fact, his brother-in-law is sitting there with him enslaved to help keep him comfortable. What that means is those ideals were not true when they were written, but Black Americans took those ideals literally. And Black Americans have really fought. You can look at what happens after Reconstruction. You can look at the abolitionist movement. You can look at the civil rights movement. Black people have fought to make those ideals real.
Perfecting democracy.
Absolutely.
I can just say this. I was so embarrassed as a person of color that I had never heard of 1619 until I read your essay, page 16, when you first talk about it. And I just thought, how do we not know this? And I'm not the only one. There was only one person in the room, Betsy over there, who went to Harvard. She knew about you, and she knew all about this project and knew all about this date. But you said it's time to stop hiding from our sins and confront the truth. What do you mean?
What I mean is...
And how do we not know about this, Nicole?
We don't know about 1619 the same way that we don't learn very much about slavery. It is shameful. No one wants to talk about their sins or the worst moments. And slavery gives contradiction to our entire creation story of the United States. And so we've tried to push it aside. We've tried to make it marginal. And in doing that, we've marginalized the 40 million descendants of the enslaved as well. So what we're trying to do with this project is force us to confront the truth, and then maybe we can actually start to move past slavery and become the country that was written in our ideals in the Constitution and the Declaration.
It's an effort to reframe American history, but some critics have said it's an effort to delegitimize American history. From the Cato Institute, Illa Shapiro tweeted, it's a project intended to delegitimize mankind's grandest experiment in human liberty. Is it divisive in that way?
I mean, think what's amazing about that is people are not arguing the facts. So what they're basically arguing is that we should only talk about certain facts. We should talk about the good part of Thomas Jefferson, but not about the fact that he was an enslaver. I'm saying that history is history, and we have to tell the truth. No, it's not delegitimizing, because the whole point of the article is that Black Americans have used those founding words to actually bring us closer to the democracy that the founders envisioned. And that is the most patriotic of things.
You can take us, the thing that's so amazing about this, that makes me so proud, you can look at anything that's happening, just about anything that's happening in the world today and tie it to slavery. You look at the highways in Atlanta, you look at the naming of Wall Street, you look at sugar that we eat. But the thing that stuck out to me was healthcare, that you can tie healthcare to slavery. How?
Absolutely. So there's a piece in there about why we're the only Western industrialized country that doesn't have universal health care. And it starts with opposition to universal health care that occurs right after slavery, when the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to offer free health care to the formerly enslaved. And there was white opposition to that. And so even today, you see with polling that white Americans will reject social programs if they think large numbers of Black people will benefit from them. And so the harms of slavery have not been contained, because there are millions of white Americans, there are millions of Latinos and Asian and Black Americans who don't have health care, who can't get insurance because of slavery.
You say don't look at Black people as a problem, look at Black people as a solution.
Yes, from the beginning, there have been, thousands of pages dedicated to saying that Black people are, as Abraham Lincoln said, a troublesome presence in our democracy. But really, what we're arguing with this project is Black Americans have been the perfecters of this democracy, and that if we ever got to the point we would stop seeing us as a problem, we would actually be more of the America that we want to be.
Nicole, I stepped briefly on your line earlier. You see this as a patriotic act?
Yes, of course it is. This isn't saying that this is a country that needs to be destroyed. This is not saying that this is a country that's illegitimate. It's saying that this was a country founded on ideals that were not true at the time, but that Black Americans believed in those ideals and have worked to make those ideals true for all groups. I don't see what is more patriotic than that.
Well, you couldn't have expected this reaction, which is huge, by the way. Congrats.
Thank you so much.
Congrats and bravo to you. Tomorrow on CBS's.
I'm trying to reshare. Sorry, everyone. Apparently, there's boxes on my screen and I can't see them.
It's all good. They did not obscure the important bits of the video, so it's all good. So that's Nikole Hannah-Jones, and I think that she makes a really fantastic point, which is that this effort, that the 1619 Project, right, which is really, the argument here is to think about 1619 as being the founding date for our country, or a pivotal founding date for our country. Not 1776, right, when the Declaration of Independence was written, right, but earlier, because institutions are formed and they were built on slavery, right? That's essentially what she's arguing, that the physical country, right, was built by Black folks, and that the institutions of this country are built upon slavery. And so we can't pretend that it didn't happen. We shouldn't pretend that it didn't happen. And that it's really about centering, right, the experiences of Black Americans in the historical narrative. So it goes back to what I was talking about before, right, which is if you focus on the great white men of history, right, if you focus on the founding fathers, then yeah, the country starts in 1776, right? But if you don't center that experience, then you're going to have a different start date, right? You're going to have different things that you're going to focus on if you don't just focus on the most powerful group of people in the United States. And so that's why it's so important to talk about women's history. That's why it's so important to talk about Black history and Chicano history and Native American history and Asian American history, because we see a different story, stories that often are not included in our mainstream, right, sort of dominant historical narrative. And they're not included because we don't come out looking so good, right, as a country, right? We've made a lot of mistakes and we've done a lot of bad things. And it's easier to not talk about those things and to not focus on those things. And that's really, Hannah-Jones's argument, is that we need to talk about those things because they're affecting current issues today. And if we don't talk about those things, then how can we understand what's happening today, right? And how can we fix it, right? If we don't understand why things are the way they are. So that's essentially the argument that she's making. And she uses different things that they talk about in that little clip, right? They talked about healthcare, about schooling systems. There's all sorts of different things that she points to that exist today that are influenced by slavery and by the institutions of slavery, which the country was built on. So those are essentially the arguments that she's making, and she has different articles that address different topics. This is from her first article where she sort of introduces the topic and the idea. And she says, I had been taught in school through cultural osmosis that the flag, she's talking about the US flag, wasn't really ours, that our history as a people began with enslavement and that we had contributed little to this great nation. It seemed that the closest thing Black Americans could have to cultural pride was to be found in our vague connection to Africa, a place we had never been. That my dad felt so much honor in being an American felt like a marker of his degradation, his acceptance of our subordination. Like most young people, I thought I understood so much when in fact I understood so little. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he raised that flag. He knew that our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible, that the United States simply would not exist without us. So that's really what she's wanting people to think about, right? By calling it 1619, by drawing attention to these foundations that exist before the country, right, formally exists as the United States, she wants us to rethink and to refocus and to recenter, right, the experiences and the contributions of Black Americans. So that's really what she's getting at here. Now, this has been a very controversial topic. There's been a ton of pushback from historians, from politicians, the former president even, tweeted about it and had a whole thing about it. There were efforts to try and ban this kind of curriculum. There are efforts to ban ethnic studies curriculum in different states. There's currently a law banning ethnic studies in Arizona that's been on the books for several years. So these are controversial things when you decenter, right? The more powerful, dominant groups in society, when you decenter their story and you start wanting to talk about other people's stories, right? There's a lot of pushback and a lot of issues with that and a lot of challenges, right? That people are being un-American or unpatriotic. But I agree with Nikole Hannah-Jones in saying that I don't think that it's unpatriotic to challenge and to question things. I think that to become better, to become our best selves, we have to be honest with ourselves and we have to interrogate those things and we have to think about our history really critically. We can't just accept things at face value. So I would encourage you to do that, both in your thinking about history and thinking about current events, right? Don't just accept what you're sort of being told, right? Think about it critically and make your own decisions. Okay, so I think I'm done with my little rant for today about history. Any thoughts anyone wants to share or to talk about in regards to Nikole Hannah-Jones or the 1619 Project or issues that I was talking about in general? Oh, Yolanda, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, when you were saying, when Nikole was talking about the segregation in 79, that was odd because I remember that's the year I graduated, and that was the last year that we had all Black schools and all white schools. The next year they had changed it and segregated where Blacks and white went to school together. So I remember that in the paper. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it just brought back a lot of memories,
Thank you for sharing, Yolanda. And I see two other hands, Valerie and Bennett.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that there were actually laws that banned ethnic studies in some schools. And I'm just curious, what reasoning do they give or what can they possibly say that would actually legalize banning teaching our history? I don't understand how that can work.
Well, the argument that they've made in Arizona and other places is that it's racially divisive and that it promotes hatred of other racial groups. They don't name which racial groups, but they're saying basically that if you teach ethnic studies, then you're going to create hatred against white people. That's the sort of subtext of that argument.
I understand what you're saying, it just still doesn't make sense.
Well, it doesn't make sense to me either. I mean, I know what they're arguing. I don't agree with it, obviously, based on what I teach. I teach women's history and Chicano history here. And we're, just creating some ethnic studies classes and an ethnic studies degree. So that's something we're doing here at Cuyamaca right now. So I'm 100% in support, right, of making sure that we get the full picture. yeah, there are not certain politicians, certain political parties, and certain states, right, have a lot of strong feelings about who should be educated and on what. And I think it's really important that we understand too how much education varies across the states, particularly in K through 12. That is all decided at the state level. So your education in New York, in Georgia, in Florida, in Texas, in California, in Idaho are all going to be different. And they're going to be telling different stories. So Bennett?
Yes. I'm going to piggyback kind of off Yolanda's comment that she made. I grew up in Texas, and so right around that time frame when the busing started happening, and I saw it from the other perspective, being in a white privileged area, and then they would bring one person of color into our school. And just recently, since I moved to California, I've thought back and how bad he must have felt and how alone he must have felt, being the odd one out, and people didn't talk to him. I felt horrible.
Thank you for sharing, Bennett. Yeah, I mean, that's part of what Nikole Hannah-Jones is getting at, which is that busing and putting one or two children of color in a predominantly white school is not desegregation. And, to pretend that it is, right, and to argue that it is disingenuous and hypocritical, is really what she's arguing in a lot of her pieces on segregation and education.
Yeah, and it kind of sets them up to fail.
So thank you. So Daniel, I believe your hand was up next.
Okay, so from seeing the 1619 project, I just felt that it was very fascinating that they're doing all this research, but also I think that there's a lot of PTSD involved on both sides and trauma on that end, because there's a lot of people aren't ready to handle that kind of thing. There's a lot of secrets that are going to come out with the 1619 project that just from observation that a lot of people aren't ready to confront. But there's going to be an opposition.
Yeah, and I agree that the hard truths are not something that we want to focus on or that we choose to focus on very often. But the argument, again, that Nikole Hannah-Jones makes is that this is a reality. Right? This is a reality. These are things that are impacting people of color. And a lot of folks these are not new things for them necessarily. In some cases it is, right? New information. But a lot of it is going to be challenging for white folks, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it just because it's uncomfortable, right? But I understand, there's always going to be pushback against anything that challenges the status quo, anything that challenges existing power structures. That's just the way it's always been, and that's not going to change. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the hard conversations. I think we should, right? And that we should push back against, unequitable systems that are in place. Miranda?
Yeah, just like in the video, she said that, I don't know, she said something about African Americans being the most American.
Mm-hmm.
And she mentioned every race except for Native Americans, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like that wasn't very, and I feel like there was probably a better way to handle that.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Miranda. And she's talked about Native Americans and their contributions and experiences in other articles and in other works. So she doesn't ignore the experience of Native Americans or the fact that they were here, right, first before anybody else. And she talks about it, but again, this isn't an effort on her part to center the experiences of Native Americans, right? She's really wanting to say, hey, we should focus on the experiences of Black Americans. And so that's, she's not ignoring Native Americans, but it's important to make sure that we understand what her goal and intention was with this project, which is to center the experiences of Black Americans and their contributions and how foundational they are to the country. So I don't know if that helps, but that's
yeah.
I
mean, a little. I just feel like when you use words like most and I don't know, it's, yeah.
I understand.
It feels really isolating, I guess. Like it feels less inclusive of everyone else.
I understand, and I definitely, based on, I've read a lot of her things and listened to a lot of interviews with her, and I don't think that's her intention, is to exclude anyone. I think her intention, again, is to just highlight the experiences and the contributions of Black Americans. And is it Shireen? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, my square moved on the screen. I went to unmute and couldn't hit it. I grew up in San Diego in a middle class white area of town. And there were African Americans that were bused into my school. And my recollection is, we were accepting at the time. I feel rather naive thinking that I would truly understand how they felt. However, I do recall another thing that they did with us, because we were really trying at the time, at least the administration was trying to really help us understand busing and integration. They actually had days every year where they would take a bus. They would ask whoever would volunteer to get on a bus to go over to Lincoln High School or a different school that is predominantly African American. And I remember getting on the bus and going down to the school and being scared and walking around the school. And then I realized if I was scared because I was just not sure if they were going to be friendly to me and welcome me, they must have felt the same way coming to my school every day of the year. So at the time I was rather naive. I was a little kid. I was just doing what, they told us to do. But I feel like I didn't really recognize what they were going through, even though I didn't feel prejudiced myself. I look back and I realized they really struggled, and it was hard for them to do that day in and day out.
Thank you for sharing. It's hard to imagine someone else's reality when that's not ours. And that's, again, I think why a project such as these are so important, because this is an attempt to do that, right? It's an attempt to get everyday folks in the majority of the population to look at a perspective that they don't normally sit in. And so that's, I think, one of the important things about looking at multiple histories, at looking at multiple perspectives, and about this kind of journalism. I think it's so valuable, right? For us to look at things from a different perspective in a different way. So I know that we're past time a couple of minutes. So if you need to go, I understand that. If you'd like to stay, Marissa and I are happy to continue doing Q&A for a bit longer, but I just wanted to acknowledge for anyone who has something else to do after this. If you're super busy and have back-to-back things and you need to go, I understand, no worries. So I just wanted to thank you for coming if you need to take off. But please feel free to stay and to listen and to participate in the Q&A, because this is a really great conversation. So thanks, everybody. So I think Analinda is next.
Oh, awesome. No, I just want to say thank you so much for this event. Thank you so much for this event. Again, just the broad contributions from science to, again, journalism and, again, history. I think it's fascinating, just the idea of the things that you mentioned as far as, sorry, I have a small cold, lynching, and then talking about that idea as domestic terrorism and how that still occurs to this very day, just domestic terrorism in multiple ways. And then just the idea that she had to move to protect herself and family. And then again, that still happens to journalists today when they speak truth to power, and just the retaliation and how, again, even media or talking heads will frame things to put these people in this position when they're just speaking truth to power. And then with Nicole, there's so many different marginalized groups, and then having to be in that setting where they're asking you questions. Again, I think they were kind of interrupting and stuff like that, where, again, it's very hard to try to defend these things. And it's amazing when to see them, to hear about it. It's fantastic. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries, it's my pleasure. And what I didn't get to, which is there's been so much pushback, ongoing pushback, still pushback, that there are people lobbying to have her Pulitzer Prize revoked, like crazy stuff, like personal attacks, you know, and trying to get her Pulitzer Prize removed. So yeah, so this is, you know, disproportionate. Yeah, it's pretty out there. You know, she shared in a couple of interviews that she expected pushback, right? Because of the subject matter and because of who she was, but she didn't expect this much pushback. She didn't expect for it to get personal, you know, and to be personally attacked. So yeah, there's a lot of pushback from folks who don't agree with her, her perspective, right, on history, of her interpretation of history. But that's what history is about. It's not one story with capital F facts that are just true and that's it. Right? It's different histories that we have to put together and synthesize and interpret. And her interpretation of history that centers Black Americans is very controversial because it challenges the dominant story. It challenges power systems that have been in place for a really long time. So yeah, that's something I wanted to mention as well if we're talking about pushback and speaking truth to power. Valerie?
Sorry, I have a lot of questions. So Ida B. Wells, she was a journalist, and in that time when she was a journalist, I'm curious who employed her? How was she able to get employment as an African-American woman at that time with her thoughts, expressing herself in that way? Who was actually brave enough to say, yes, come work for me?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. There is a very robust Black newspaper, Black magazine, Black literary sort of circle during this time period. And so publications in the northern states when slavery was still in force were widely circulated. That's how a lot of ideas about abolition, ending slavery were circulated. That's how a lot of ideas with Black intellectuals and Black abolitionists were circulated and discussed. And then when slavery is ended in the South, we'll start to see the emergence of Black owned and Black run periodicals, newspapers, magazines, and things of that nature. So that's where she gets her start. But eventually she's picked up by white papers and things like that in certain cities in the North and also again in Europe. And she goes on speaking tours in Europe as well. So she becomes an internationally known journalist during her time period.
Okay, thank you. And then Dr. Salazar, if I can, in the beginning, you mentioned the gender pay gap, and I've been researching that a little bit for my final project, and I read comments to an article where people were saying, well, women just don't know how to negotiate. They don't know what they're doing. So is there any research on the different ways men and women can negotiate a pay rate, or is that just people talking out of turn?
So I would assume that the person that made that comment doesn't have any type of background to actually make that comment, and it was just kind of an offhand comment.
Real evidence.
It's more into if we think about the way women are perceived and women in power specifically. So if we look at, for example, the activity we did about describing words to describe people. If you describe a woman as assertive versus a man as assertive, they're perceived very differently, right? The same way in which women who assert themselves, women who ask to be paid a fair wage, a lot of the time that's perceived that way as well. There's also research when we talk about, at an interview, asking women if they are pregnant or are planning to become pregnant, or if they currently have kids. We know that while that is not legal, that happens a lot, right? And so that also contributes to that gender wage gap and gender pay gap. But it's not because women can't negotiate. That is absolutely not been found in any of the data.
Yeah, I immediately went to look for research articles. I'm like, I'm not finding anything. I'm pretty sure you're just babbling. But yes. I wanted
yeah. Can I add something to that, Marissa, too? So I think part of it too has to do with stereotype threat, with women understanding that if they're too assertive, that they'll be viewed, right? As, I don't want to cuss, but the B word or whatever, you know what I mean? That we understand that we're perceived in a different way from men when we do the same things. And so then we like self-regulate in order to not be perceived in that sort of way. So that's something I think too that could contribute to that, where you sort of hold back or you question yourself, right? Because you're afraid of how you'll be perceived. And then I think too, it has also to do with socialization, right? And that women are not necessarily in all families and in all societies socialized to be assertive, to advocate for themselves and things like that. So I think there's a lot of factors at play, but I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Salazar that it is not something inherent in women that we don't have the ability to negotiate. That's sexist and completely wrong. So.
Yeah, and when we talk about, Valerie, the stereotype content model in class, which is the idea that women are stereotypically perceived as warm. So when a woman is in power, she's perceived as competent, but not warm. All of that plays into how women are perceived, negotiating strategies, all of that. So we'll talk more about it definitely in class.
And I think, Yolanda, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was making a comment to the girl that was talking about the women. I think a lot of that came from back in the day, as well as slavery, whatever. When we were brought up, men were dominant to women. So that's why today it's still hard for us to become, trying to be equal or be paid equal or be seen as equal to men, because back in the day we were submissive. We were taught to be submissive to men. So to them, men look at us that way because that's what they were brought up to learn. They were learned that. So it just seemed like it's just something we're still trying to outgrow and learn, that we deserve to be that equal part of society and not lower as we were taught, because things have changed and we've changed. Society has changed. So that I was just making that.
That's a really great point, Yolanda. It speaks to the historian in me. I won't go into the whole history of it, but that's hugely important, right? It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And it's going to take us a while to outgrow, as you said, right? Or to move beyond those kinds of ideas. Anybody else have thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah, Bennett.
Yeah, I just want to clarify what I was trying to get across before about living in Texas and the busing system. The main point I was trying to get across, and I didn't get it out, was that I think that racism starts by being taught. I mean, you're a product of your surrounding, and if you grow up in a certain, area, and around your friends that talk a certain way, your family talks a certain way, you're gonna become that just because of where you are. And it's not until later in life when you're able to change your values. And it happened for me when I moved to San Diego, and I moved to Spring Valley middle school. It was fully interracial. And I thought I was going to be the dumb one because I'm coming from Texas with that dang old Texas Southern drawl. I got, sounds kind of stupid. So instead of judging me, they all welcomed me with both open arms. And so it made me, really appreciate everybody else. The anthropology course that I'm taking right now on cultures, I probably learned more in 3 months than I have in my life about other people. And I'm very, very glad I took it.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bennett.
No
yeah,
way.
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope. Both of you girls killed it. Awesome job.
Thanks, Bennett. So I think that it's something that Bennett said is super important for us to remember is that racism and any sort of prejudice is 100% learned, and that that's sort of how I see my job, and how, you know, I see my role in the world is to help people unlearn that, right? To realize where all of it came from, and to make a different choice, right? As Bennett said. And so but that's a hard thing to do too, right? And so understanding that this has got a long history to it, and we're not going to magically be able to undo it all overnight. But you know, it's a process, and we just have to keep on trucking. But yeah, if it's learned, it can be unlearned. And then I see two more hands, Miranda and Alexis.
I just want to say I totally agree with Bennett. Sometimes, you know, we see things and we decide we totally don't want to be like the people around us. You know, I remember growing up and seeing family members do things that I totally didn't agree with, and make jokes that I, you know, thought were, I don't know, even at 5, that I was like, oh no. And, you know, I don't know why I thought that way, but I remember being 5 and wanting to marry Michael Jackson and, you know, be Madonna. So yeah. And we lived in a tiny town in Pennsylvania with like 500 people. So, you know, that was not normal for that area. But yeah, so I think sometimes, I don't know, sometimes we see people do things and we decide we don't want to be like them. You know, we go the opposite way, and sometimes, yeah. So.
Thanks for sharing, Miranda. And Alexis?
Hi, I just had a quick little comment. I just want to say thank you to Bennett, and I believe her name was Yolanda, and Moriah, and this whole presentation has been so amazing and eye-opening. I just want to say thank you for them for passing on their memories of such a tender time in their lives, and thank you for rewiring your brain to push on the future generation something more greater than the ideals that were hindering our growth and awakening and enlightenment. Is just so amazing, and I'm just very grateful to be a part of an era that is so progressive. And even though I myself, I'm in a quote unquote man-dominated industry, I see a lot of these issues going on myself, and there are other women in my industry. We're all fighting for equality, especially when the pay rates when trust me, I'm definitely feeling that I think it was like 80 cents on a dollar to 50 cents on the dollar situation. That's ridiculous. That's still going on. But the negotiation, so much pushback, and I'm the one to negotiate. There's so much pushback, but I am seeing progression and equality coming up every single day as everyone pushes for it. I just want to thank you guys all for your contribution to that.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, Alexis. And I second your appreciation of people sharing their stories and their personal experiences and their viewpoints. I think it's made this conversation really a really rich one. So thank you guys for that. Anybody else have anything they want to say? Have we kept you past too long?
I just want to echo, Moriah, what you said. Thank you all for being brave. These conversations are very difficult to have. And I'm so glad that you all feel welcome and that we've created a space together where we can have these conversations and hopefully learn from each other. So thank you for letting me come today and present this information to you all.
I was kind of scared until I saw your face and I got a little more calmer. So I was glad you was here. I was like, yes.
We're all learning. Rewatching the panel.
Moriah, you were good too. I'm so used to Marissa. That's all. I
appreciate that. No worries. I love her too. So it's all good. I understand.
Moriah, do you know if these will be posted on our Culture and Community Circle page, the recording eventually?
Yes, they will. Rena, are you still here?
Oh.
Yep, I am. So I actually had a meeting recently to be able to successfully upload the recording. So by next week, everything should be up and loaded on the student affairs page. And we do have a tab for the workshop, so all the videos will be located there.
Great. Would you mind terribly, Rena, putting the link to that page in the chat so folks can find it easily?
Of course. One moment.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rena. Well, while you can stay on if you want and wait for Rena to put the link in so you can watch this later or share it with other folks if that's something that you'd be interested in doing. But I've run out of words for today, at least. But thank you guys again so much for coming. I really appreciate all of your perspectives and your honesty and your willingness to have the hard conversations with us today.
Yes, thank you all. And if you're interested, we have a couple more great events planned for this month. I know I've shared it with my classes, but the events will be on the page that Rena is putting in the chat as well.
And she just dropped the link in the chat. If you want to grab that, you can get access to the other dates and the links for the other events and for the reporting for today's event. It should be up in a few days. So thank you all so much. I'm going to stop recording now.